Christy. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to day 3 of my 2022 holiday card series. Today I'm going to be making a card using the Hello Bluebird Snowman Competition stamp set. So I've stamped those images out on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn jet black ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with my snowman and I'm using a new to me combination. I was trying to mimic some Distress Oxide that I'll be using later on. It's the speckled eggshell and how it blends with faded jeans. So I decided to go with B91 and then blend it out with BG70, which may seem a little weird to mix a blue with a blue-green, but I think it actually really worked and it gave me similar vibes to what I was going for, so I think this is a good one. I'm going to do the other snowballs exactly the same since all of these critters here are creating their fun little snow people for this little competition. This stamp set is just so darling and such a fun and unique idea. This has got to be one of my favorites from the brand new Hello Bluebird release. So I'm just starting with a little B91, blending that out with BG70, and then I'm going to let that fade into the white cardstock. Then I'm going to do the carrot nose using YR12, YR14, and YR18. I'm also going to do the bird's beak and the other carrot that the other little bunny is nibbling on, which is such a fun image. I think that's just so adorable. I'm starting with the YR18 and blending out with the YR14 and then finishing with a highlight using the YR12 on all of those pieces. So it's getting to be the time of year when we have deeper shadows, and it was just casting too much on those images on the top row. So I decided to shift my marker caps over to the left hand side, see how I liked that. And I'm using N0, N1, N3, and N5 for my squirrel. So I'm starting with the N5 and laying in some shadows. Normally I like to color squirrels to look like my favorite animal, which is the red squirrel, but I wanted to go with this very unique color palette today. Not necessarily unique, but just very specific palette that I had in mind, which is like blues and reds and gray tones. So I ended up going with the gray squirrel, and I think he looks super cute that way too. So once I had the N5 laid in, I blended that out with the N3, making sure to cast a deep shadow underneath his tail where the fluffy part is kind of overlapping and would be casting a shadow there. Also, the bunny's back is bent there, so there really wouldn't be a whole lot of light getting in on that under part of the tail. And then I'm going to blend forward using the N1, and I'm going to fill in most of the squirrel with that shade. I'm going to save a little bit of space at the top of his tail for the N0, and I'm also going to add that to his belly, and then I'll use the N1 and the N0 to color in the other part of his face. So it's getting nice and soft, and you can see that the marker caps on my left hand side was just getting in my way. I felt like I was being crowded in because I'm left-handed. So I swapped it to the right hand side and I like that a lot better. So let me know if that is an improvement to you to not have them up at the top of the cardstock panel that I'm coloring on. It'll take a little bit of getting used to, but I think it might work. It definitely helped eliminate those shadows. So I'm moving on to the fox, and again I decided to go with a gray fox since I'm going with this color palette, or it could be a wolf. I think you could make it either one. I decided to go with cool grays for him just to make him a little bit different. I'm using C0, C1, C3, and C5. So I started with the C5 and I'm laying my shadows down the right side of his body since he's facing toward the left. I'm going to have kind of a central light source on today's card. So the fox is going to go on the right hand side of the card. So it makes sense that the highlight would be on his face, which is how I typically like to do it anyway, and then the shadows to fall down his back. So once I was done with the C5, I blended that out with the C3, and then I'm going to use the C1, and I'm going to fill in all the rest of his body with that, just reserving that C0 for the lower part of his face and his belly and the tip of his tail. And I decided to color in his feet completely as well. I usually like to leave little socks and things, but I just decided to color him in solid for this one. And then, like I said, just use that C0 for those white areas. And then I'm going to move on to my bunnies. And for those, I'm going to use E000, E50, and E51. I wanted them to be like a really pale buff color. So I'm starting with the E51 and doing my shadows for them. And I did those both on the right hand side, even though the top bunny is going on the right hand side of the card, so it works. The bottom bunny that has the squirrel stain on him is going to go on the left hand side, but because that squirrel is pretty much blocking him from the light in the center of the card, I decided to put the shadows down his back. That just made the most sense to me. So once I had the E51 in, I blended that out with the E50, and then I'm coming in with the E000 and just adding a little bit of shading in there. I am going to leave little parts on the belly and the lower part of the face white and just let that kind of fade softly. And then I went back to my C1 to color in the bottom of the tail, give that a little shading. And then I'm moving over to my cardinal, and I'm going to use R35, R37, and R39. This is a red that's a little bit more pink toned. It's more like a cranberry red, which I've kind of been in the mood for lately, and I think it suits holiday cards really well, and also suits the other colors that I'll be using in this palette a little bit better than like a bright fire engine red. So I started with the R39, again with the shadows, putting them down the back on the left hand side because he's going toward the left on the card, and then blending out with the R37, and then I'll fill in any white space with the R35, using that on the tip of his tail and on his belly as well. Now that all my critters are colored in, I wanted to give everybody some rosy cheeks and color in the ears for anybody who needed a little color there. And I decided to go with cooler pinks rather than my usual shades that I use for this, just because it's a snowy scene and I've got like the cool gray, and then I'm going to have a lot of blue tones in the sky. So I chose RV00, RV10, and RV11. And I'm going to do the cheeks and the insides of the ears of the fox and the bunnies, and give the snowman some rosy cheeks. I really think this just makes the characters look so much more cheerful and happy, and it's just a nice touch. It just gives them a little extra glow to them, I think. So once I have everybody blended out with those shades, I'm going to start doing some of these accessory images. And the first combo I'm using for that is RV63, RV66, and RV69. This is like a nice magenta red. It's got a little bit of a purpley tone to it, but definitely still very warm. And I think it looks really nice with the red of the cardinal in this palette. So I put the RV69 down the back and in the creases, kind of extended out those creases a bit, and then blended forward with the RV66. And then I'll use the RV63 for the highlight. And I'm going to do the scarf of the bunny that's eating the carrot, and then also the squirrel that's standing on the other bunny's back. And then I'm going to switch up to a slightly more dusty red, kind of. So I'm using R83, R85, and R89. These are reds that have a lot of gray tone in them. They're very desaturated. And I just wanted like another shade of red that kind of just ties everything together. So this is something kind of between the magenta that I used on the other scarves and between the more cranberry red of the cardinal. I'm going to give the bunny some little mittens to match, and then I'm going to do the fox's scarf in these same shades. Just starting with that R89 and then blending out with the R85 as the mid-tone. And then I'll come in with the R83 for a nice highlight at the base of the throat and also at the tops of the tails of the scarf, where those are kind of fluttering behind and, you know, kind of catching the light there. I'm also going to give the fox some matching mittens, and I did only use the darkest two shades on the cuff of the mittens for both the fox and the bunny, just to give them a little bit of a contrasting look since they're rolled up there. And then for the snowman, I decided to go back to the cranberry reds that I used on the cardinal, but to make it look a little bit different, I left off the R39 and added in the R32, so it's still going to have a little bit of a unique look to it because it'll be a bit lighter and a little bit more pinky toned, especially when I get that R32 mixed in there, but it'll definitely match with the cardinal and just kind of add that little bit of symmetry. There's kind of two elements of each of these red tones on this scene here. So I started with the R37, blended out with the R35, and then I'm using that R32 for that nice highlight. And then for the little twigs, I'm going to go back to the E50s, but I'm going to darken up the tones that I used on the bunnies and go with some deeper shades using the E57 and the E59. Just a little of the E59 to cast a bit of shadow, and then blending out with the E57. They're very thin, so just the two colors I think is plenty. And then I'm going to grab my black Sakura Jelly Roll pen, and I'm going to go over the eyes of all of my critters and also the snowman. You could do the mouth as well, but I decided to just do the eyes because that's where I really wanted to pull focus. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to trim all of these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm taking the new Ice Skating Pond horizontal scene die, and I die cut that out of some Spectrum Noir cardstock because I wanted to add some shading with my Copics. So because the snowmen are made of the same snow that is around them, I'm going to use the same shades that I used on the snowman for the snowbanks. So I'm using that B91 first, and then I'm going to blend that out with the BG70 and just kind of make that a little bit deeper. I wanted to create some nice shadows where these hills kind of separate from each other. So I'm being pretty heavy-handed with that BG70 and making sure that it really breaks up the edge of that B91. And then just to soften up the blend on the edge, I'm going to grab my colorless blender and just trace over the very edge to help that fade into the white cardstock. Then I'm also going to use Copics to color in the trees, and I'm going to do birch trees again, and I just love birch trees. So you've seen me do this in a previous card for the Hello Bluebird release, the Thanksgiving card at Twilight, but I'm going to do them slightly different than I did on that one. So this time I'm starting with a little bit of shading on the left-hand side of each of the trees using the C0 marker Just real quick and easy. You probably could even beef this up a bit and use the C1 instead. In fact, I kind of wish that I had, because once this C0 dries back, I don't know that it's really noticeable in the final card. So if I were to do it again, I would go a little bit bolder with those shadows. Then I'm going to come in with the C7 and start to add in a few little flick marks from either side. Just kind of creating that papery bark that peels away on birch trees. It's just so beautiful and gives them such a distinctive look. And by the way, I kept the die pieces all intact because I just feel like it's easier to color it this way than to try to hold down all the individual pieces. So I just kept it right on my cutting mat and brought it over to my desk, and I found that was the easiest way to do it. I'm not worried about if I get any of this color into the background pieces, because I'm going to do the sky differently, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But first I wanted to just blend out a little bit of these lines, so I jumped down to a C3, and I'm just going over the edges really quick. You know, it's supposed to look like rough bark that's kind of peeling away, so you don't have to be too precise or neat about it. You can really be fast, and it's going to give you that look. So for the sky, I'm using a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock, and starting with that speckled egg distress oxide ink like I mentioned earlier. I think I called it speckled eggshell, and that's because there's a Lawn Fawn cardstock that I love called speckled eggshell, so the names are very similar. But anyway, I'm going to add some faded jeans to the top part of the sky, and then go back to my speckled egg and kind of smooth out that transition a bit. I'll work my way back and forth between those two ink blending tools. And then I wanted to darken up the top edge of the sky, so I'm bringing in some chipped sapphire distress oxide ink, and I'm going to pull that down about 1/3 of the way, so I'll kind of have 3 tones there, all in equal amounts. And I'm just going to work my way back and forth between those two tools as well, just making sure everything is nice and smooth. And then once I'm happy with how this is looking, I wanted to do some splatter detail, and I decided to do some dark splatters on this as well, even though I'm trying to create a starry sky. But I just wanted to have a bit of interest in there, a little bit of contrast. So I'm taking some of the chipped sapphire and adding some water to that on an acrylic block, and then I'll tap off the block with a thin paintbrush to give me little splatters, and then I'm going to mix up some of the pearlized shade of my Gansai Tambi Starry Colors, and I'll splatter some of that as well. And that's going to give me a nice pearlized shimmer, but it's not a pure white, so I decided to go one more layer using my Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. I'm going to take a little bit of that out and add that to the block. It's kind of thick, so I'm going to add a little bit of water to that and mix it up so that I can splatter that on the background as well. And that's going to be a much brighter white, so I'll have those 3 layers of splatters in the background. I can set that panel aside to dry, and then I can build my card base. So I'm working on a piece of Lawn Fawn Blue Jay cardstock, and I'm going to start with the frame of the die. And I always say this is like doing the outside pieces of a puzzle first. It just gives you that framework to fit everything else together nicely. So I'm just going to make sure that that lines up straight with the edges of the card, because it needs to be straight or everything's not going to fit perfectly. So just making sure that we're all lined up there. And then I've cut that sky panel down just a tiny sliver so it will fit right inside the edges of that frame. So I'm going to slip that in, and then I'll work my way up from the bottom with the first snowdrift, and I'll layer that down in there, just nestle that down into the framework. And then I'll take the next snowdrift, and I'm going to add that right over top of the sky piece to cover that background and the little bit of cardstock that was still showing through. Just make sure that is all fitted together nicely. And then I'm going to pop out the trees. Now, because I'm not using the extra pieces of sky in between these trees, they are not going to probably be lined up exactly as perfectly as they are on the die, but it doesn't really matter. They are slanted in such a way that it's pretty easy to see where they fit anyway. And if it's slightly off where it was supposed to be, it's no big deal. They're still going to be spaced really nicely there because there's how much space there is in that area, you know, unless you wanted to maybe overlap them a bit, but because of the slant at the bottom with the way they're cut, they kind of just go where they're supposed to anyway. If you butt it up against that snowdrift, they're going to fit pretty perfectly into that area. So I'm just going to grab this last tree and add my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue to the back, and then I'll fit that one into place as well. And then I'm going to take this entire piece and pop it in my MISTI so that I can stamp a sentiment. I'm going to use VersaFine Onyx Black ink just because it's so nice and bold. And I'm going to stamp out the sentiment that says, "Sending you a flurry of winter wishes." And it stamped perfectly the first time, so I just did it the once. Then I'm going to open up the card base and I'm going to stamp on the inside using Deep Sea ink. And there were tons of other images in this giant stamp set that I could use, but I decided to go with the goose. I just thought he was really cute. And I went with a couple snowflakes and "You Warm My Heart" for the inside sentiment. So now I'm ready to finish off this card, and I wanted to add a bit more of a frame to this to just make it a bit bolder and kind of create kind of like a cozier feel, kind of pulling the scene in a bit with this darker frame. So I die cut that same die using some narwhal cardstock, and I'm going to add 2 layers of that just to bulk it up a bit and give it a bit more of a presence on the card, almost like a picture frame. So there will be 3 layers of that frame in total, the white one that I started out with, and then the 2 layers of the gray. Just making sure that it is on there nice and straight. It was a little tiny bit off center at the bottom there. So just quickly adjusting that before the glue dries and making sure that it is smoothed down nicely. And then I can bring in my images. And there's a lot of images to go in a small amount of space here, so I am going to lay out a few of these before I commit. I know that I want the snowman to be in the center. He's kind of like the light source, as if the moon or the stars are kind of reflecting off the snow that he's made up of. So I'm going to put him in between all of these guys here, making sure that he's kind of right in the very center of the card. And then I'll add the bunny and the squirrel over on the right hand side. I'm going to just set them apart a little bit so that I can tuck something in the squirrel's paw. I want one of those little twigs to be the snowman's hand. So I'm going to add that so it looks like he's placing that. And then I'm going to take the fox and glue him over on the left hand side. And I thought about giving him the other twig, but in the end I decided to use that in a different way. So he's kind of just patting the snowman in place, making sure that the snow is nice and firm. Then down toward the bottom right, I'm going to add another snowball, and then the bunny, who is taking a little break there and having a snack. He couldn't resist the snowman's nose, so he's having a little nibble there. And then right next to him, I'll have the cardinal, which is rolling the head of their snowman. So I'll just place him right there with his tail almost pointing at that sentiment and drawing your eye there. And then the final little twig I'm going to place down at the bottom as if they've collected all their supplies to build their snowman. This is a competition after all. and they're just in the assembly process. They're a little bit behind the guys at the top. Of course, a snowy scene like this needs some glitter, so I'm going to take my favorite Stardust Stickles and I'm going to add it to the dips in each of the tree branches there where the snow and ice would kind of collect and build up some frost. So I'll do that on all 4 of the trees, and then I'm also going to add it to the snowbanks just at the very top edge there of each of those, wherever I can see that shading that I did earlier. I'm also going to add it to the snowman since he's made of the same snow and he also needed that bit of sparkle. So just kind of tracing where I had those shadowed areas, just like with the snowbanks. And then of course to the 2 snowballs down below as well. And then I decided to take a white gel pen and add some more detail in here. And I probably should have done this before I did the stickles because it was a little bit hard to not get my hands in it, but no regrets. I just decided to add some little polka dots to the scarf of the bunny and the fox. So I'm just doing little round circles. I almost did it to the mittens as well, but the mittens are such a small surface area that I felt like it might look kind of funny or too crowded or something. So I ended up just doing it on the scarves for them. And then I also wanted to add some detail to the snowman scarf. But again, because that stickles was already laid in, I had to do something just simple. So I ended up going with 2 white stripes down toward the tail end there. And that's all I'm gonna do. I might have done some more if it hadn't been for being worried about smearing that stickles, but I still think it turned out really cute. So I'll lift that up so you can see all of that sparkle, and I'll give you another peek at the inside. I really do like how this one turned out, so I hope that you do too. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button, leave me a comment down below, subscribe, ring your notification bell. All of that helps support my channel so much, and it just means the world to me. All of the products I use will be listed and linked for you in the description bar below. And if you'd like to keep watching, here is day 3 of the previous 2 years of holiday card series. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.